To tackle climate change, we'll have to put our faith in technologies that don't yet exist. That's the premise for today's conversation. Welcome to Exponentially. Renewables are booming. In fact, solar is the fastest growing energy technology in history. Why isn't this record-breaking growth enough to bring us to net zero? It turns out that some of the cornerstones of our modern life are big-ticket items when it comes to carbon pollution. More than 30% of emissions come from making steel, chemicals, cement, and food. This challenge requires new solutions. I've come to Silicon Valley to meet Vinod Khosla, a venture capitalist who has made himself and his investors billions of dollars. He's pouring that cash into technologies that sound like science fiction: synthetic meat, fermented jet fuel, and nuclear fusion. All of them huge bets to help solve the biggest problem humanity has ever faced. Now, when I first met you more than a quarter of a century ago, Vinod, you were really well known as a technology investor in traditional IT. You had built Sun Microsystems, you had invested in computer networking, Juniper, which returned 2,500 times its original investment to its investors, and one of the first internet search engines, Excite. But in recent years, you've got a reputation in a new area, which is funding entrepreneurs who are building hard technologies to tackle climate change. So it feels like there was a realization that climate change was a real problem. Can you talk me through how you came to that realization?
Well, the first time I started thinking about climate was in the late 90s, seriously. About 10% of the world's population, 700 million people or so, had a rich lifestyle. Rich in education, rich in medicine, rich in housing, rich in transportation, rich in energy in every way. 7 billion people wanted it. Mm-hmm. And when I did the math didn't work. 10 times more steel, 10 times more cement, 10 times more doctors, 10 times more...
10 times more meat.
10 times more meat.
Right.
All those were intractable problems with a linear approach to life. I decided to work on technology multipliers. Can you substitute for more steel with technology? Yes. Mm-hmm. Could you do housing differently with technology? Yes. Could you produce more doctors with technology? And I don't mean human doctors, AI doctors? Yes.
When people think about that technology, they think it's a widget like this tablet that I've got here, or it's a computer, or it's a car. But the heart of technology is that unlike so many of the other things we experience in the world, it gets cheaper every single year. And that means it's democratic, it's also inclusive. And the last time that I traveled to India, the thing that you note is that everyone there has a supercomputer because they all have smartphones. How should we think about that in terms of climate technologies?
I had this view that no large innovation ever comes from an institution of any sort. The institutional system, whether it's large companies, academics, other places, they're great at extrapolating the past, not inventing the future they want. Because inventing the future you want involves much more innovation, which means much more risk and much more probability of failure. So very large innovations only come from the entrepreneurial world. Could you imagine somebody at Hyatt or Hilton doing Airbnb? Could you imagine somebody at Hertz or Avis doing
Uber, say?
Uber?
Yeah.
Could you imagine somebody at Walmart or Target do Amazon? And frankly, the internet itself, in 1996, when we started Juniper, every major telco player told me they would never use TCP/IP
That's right.
in the public internet.
So TCP/IP being the technical standard that makes the internet work and makes it different to the old phone lines that had served us very well for 100 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
So these internet technology was taboo in the telecom world, and no telecom player wanted it. And Cisco, which was the purveyor of internet technology, said they would never do a router for the public internet. Never. That was a direct quote from the CTO of Cisco to me.
Yeah.
Back in
It's kind of their business now, though, isn't it?
It is everybody's business. My point is, you have to take these large risks. And we did say, we'll build it, and they will come.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. In fact, this particular episode, which was a very large return for Kleiner Perkins when I was there, 2,500x, about $7 billion in profit on a $3 or $4 million investment.
Not bad.
Not bad. Makes up for a lifetime of other losses and stupid things I've done in my life.
There's a very interesting parallel between that story of early internet technologies and I think what you have said about technology and climate change. One of the things that you've argued is that even though we've seen tremendous progress in the spread of solar power and wind power and electric vehicles, in the cold country of Norway, 95% of new cars are electric. In China's enormous car market, 25% of cars sold today are electric. Despite all that progress, that these proven technologies will not be sufficient for us to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and that we need to take bets on big unproven technologies. Why can't we get there with what we already have and what is already proven to be growing exponentially?
There's only a dozen things that matter. There's a dozen things that are very large emitters of carbon. And if we fix those dozen, we solve the problem. Right. If we don't fix those dozen, we will have a problem, no matter what else we do.
So, and those dozen are things like steel, where we produce billions of tons
cement,
a year,
aviation fuel,
heat, industrial heat, domestic heat,
air conditioning in people's homes. So it's all the big emitters. Agriculture is a big one, so animal protein and nitrogen fertilizer. So there's a dozen of these that are very, very important to solve. And the bulk of the emissions. If we solve this, I think the climate problem is done.
I guess your argument would be that because of the 90% poorest on the planet who expect to have a better quality of life, we can't stop the investment in people's own prosperity. And so the only way you square that circle is through technology, which is things getting cheaper.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to pick off these dozen problem areas in parallel. And the mechanism that you have seen work both in renewables and decarbonisation recently, but also through the internet, has been the instigator.
Yes.
Was that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. So Elon Musk, without Elon Musk, we wouldn't be on the path to electrification today. Whether you like him or not, whether he succeeds or fails, he has changed the worldview, the big automakers, on where the future lies.
What are 3 or 4 other problem areas that you're finding exciting?
So, long time ago, we invested in LanzaTech. Jennifer Holmgren is trying to change aviation fuel to a sustainable aviation fuel. In fact, the goal is to produce it eventually from waste, municipal waste. So municipal waste to aviation fuel would solve the carbon emissions from aviation. That's a really big example. Now, we invest in Commonwealth Fusion Systems. When I met Bob Mumgaard, he was just a senior fellow at the MIT Plasma Fusion Lab and thinking about starting this company, and we helped him get going. And if we get fusion, if you're right, we will have fusion for the planet in reliable energy. Now, solar and wind are great. They've done very well. But you don't want to watch your football game only when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing.
Right.
Al Gore is just wrong on the cost of solar power. Solar power that's reliable and available when you want to watch your football game, not when the sun's shining, is much more expensive today and not practical.
Well, I was going to say, though, Vinod, that, of course, you've also backed Jagdeep Singh, who makes batteries with QuantumScape. So potentially you could put Jagdeep's batteries and other storage solutions with solar and wind and can then have that consistency.
Like, even we are taking alternative approaches to the same problems.
Right.
So we may have a battery solution, and we have multiple battery solutions. And I'm very optimistic about deep geothermal, which would make geothermal power 100 times more available if you could drill deep enough. And my dream would be to drill right under coal plants, under coal plants, and tap 400-degree heat under the coal plant so we get heat and replace the coal without replacing the coal plant. So we have millimeter wave drilling, just like your microwave oven, heating, to do deep drilling. So I'm saying just because we're doing fusion doesn't mean we aren't doing geothermal also, and batteries for storage so solar power becomes reliable.
There is so much technology in here. This almost feels like science fiction. It's pretty remarkable, and it does feel that these are unproven. So if I was a policymaker or just a concerned parent, I'd need some assuaging that we could rely on these bets. I mean, how do you give comfort to someone who would say, these are all uncertain? How will we know they could even pay off?
Well, uncertainty is a critical part of what we need to deal with. I would say only the improbables are important because it's the only way to do this technology multiplication so all 7 billion people can enjoy the lifestyle of the richest 700 million. So we have to take risks. Now, what is the solution if Commonwealth fusion doesn't work and geothermal heat doesn't work? There's 10 other fusion efforts that others are doing, and I'm very, very glad that others are doing it. And not only did Bob Mumgard, who's a real instigator in fusion, he's instigated a dozen other people to start other efforts.
Right. So competitors with different technical and scientific approaches.
Not only that, we just invested last week in a new effort called Rialta Fusion, where Bob is helping them build the magnets for his competitor in fusion.
So let's talk about fusion power, which is really from the realms of science fiction. You have backed a founder called Bob Mumgard, who was an academic. He was up at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and his business, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, CFS. Now, fusion is a really difficult technical problem. You know, it involves getting a plasma of rare gases up to temperatures many, many hundreds, thousands times hotter than the center of the sun, containing that, controlling it, and then somehow extracting useful electricity from it, and doing that all safely in an industrial-sized unit somewhere. How do you even go about addressing that problem?
Well, they think logically in small chunks. So we raised the first $100 million for Commonwealth Fusion with an odd argument that if we built a 20 Tesla magnet, which was a key risk in getting to real fusion, if fusion didn't work, we could use the magnets for nuclear medicine, for example, in your local hospital. So there were other uses for these strong magnets, MRI machines, power lines, nuclear medicine.
But let's be clear, you're talking about a 20 Tesla magnet here for fusion, whereas a high-end MRI machine might have a 3 Tesla magnet. And this is sort of orders of magnitude, right? From 3 to 4 to 5 to 20. It's not just 6 times more, it's 17 orders of magnitude more powerful.
The thing to understand about magnets, for example, and this was a key realization, the size of a fusion reactor will scale inversely with the 4th power of the magnet strength. So if you go from 5 Tesla magnet to 20 Tesla, your fusion reactor will be 250 times smaller. Think about it.
Right.
That not only makes it manageable, constructible fast, changeable fast, much lower cost,
it makes
affordable.
It modular. And so with the modularity, you can string these things together. You increase volumes. When you increase volumes, you improve learning rates, so your unit cost comes down. It's what we did with silicon chips.
Yes. So strong magnets will allow fusion to become realistic. What else happened here? High temperature semiconductors were developing, and they enabled these high magnets. So transition in one technology in high temperature superconductors allowed for high Tesla magnets, which allowed for fusion. But let me go even further. There's a beautiful plan Bob and I have talked about. We don't need to build fusion power plants. And everybody says you can't build 5,000 power plants, the regulation, permitting, all grid connections. There's a much simpler entrepreneurial solution to this. We won't build fusion plants. We'll take coal plants and replace the coal boiler with a fusion boiler and let the plant be.
Provided you can get the size down.
Provided we can get the size down, which we're pretty sure will be the same size or smaller than a boiler. If I might spend one more minute on this analogy, because this is where experts are almost always wrong.
Right.
And that's why they've not participated in any large innovation, whether it's experts at big energy companies like GE or Siemens or experts at Volkswagen or GM. They don't think non-linearly. I say all this to you and say, how are you going to build that many fusion reactors? Let me give you the following analogy. In the Second World War, there were 5 Liberty ships built in the United States in the 10 years before the Second World War started.
Right.
The next 5 years, we built close to 5,000 Liberty ships. If we can do that, can we build 5,000 fusion reactors using high volume technologies like solar manufacturing?
Yeah.
No question we can. I think the pundits are fundamentally wrong about these things.
The climate change problem is really significant. We can't get there with our existing sets of technologies, and we need to find some unproven technologies that will be supported by these key instigators, these characters with certain qualities to make the improbable happen. But there's still this question, I suppose, of scale and the billions of tons of steel and cement and so on. And 2050 is it's less than 3 decades away. So how do you actually get to that scale? I mean, I could see that through these exponentials, these technologies could get cheaper very, very quickly, and we could start to build them in great quantities. But that in of itself doesn't get you there by 2050, right? It might get you there by 2070 or 2090. Is it going to involve government incentives or interventions of some sort or some other magical thinking?
So those kinds of claims are the purview of experts and gurus and pundits who pontificate but don't actually do things. Scaling is a much easier problem. If I've reduced fusion to replacing 5,000 coal boilers and natural gas boilers in the United States, that's a very solvable problem. I just gave you the math we did with Liberty warships.
Yeah.
Right? That becomes a scalable problem. So do we have to demonstrate a power plant by the early 30s? Yes. Do we need to build 10 or 20 in the 30s? Yes. That then sets us up, starting in 2040, to really scale it in the next 5 years to every plant in the US.
The Liberty warship example you gave out was, of course, a government initiative. And many of the core technologies of the internet started as government-funded initiatives. And we've seen how government interventions can transform industries. So, for example, the arrival of the Environmental Protection Agency drove down vehicle tailpipe emissions successfully over 30 or 40 years. So in your picture of improbable, difficult, yet to scale technologies that are required over the next 20 or 30 years, what role should governments play?
Well, government has an important role to play. I'm talking about a lot of technologies where the initial costs of the first plant, the first 5 plants, the first 10 plants is above the cost of the fossil competitors. So subsidies do play a role. Unfortunately, subsidies get locked in instead of being declining with scale or time. And they always should decline with scale and time. But it's very important to get these nascent technologies started because they have a premium cost, which Bill Gates calls the green premium, that has to be covered by somebody, and governments can cover it till it gets to scale. No
Yeah.
reason for subsidies on solar or wind today.
Absolutely.
They're cheap enough.
So a government could step in with some time-limited declining subsidies in order to drive down the cost curve so a market can form. The thing about that policy that I find so interesting is that it should appeal to those on the left of the economic spectrum because it democratizes technology, making it affordable for smaller firms and for households across every country and in every country. And it should appeal to those on the right of the economic spectrum because by having that early intervention, you create a market which entrepreneurs can then occupy and build businesses around. Why do we not see more of that policy cropping up in the United States and across Europe historically?
The people on the right have generally not liked the idea of any government intervention in anything. And to be honest, this kind of approach will disrupt the traditional business in each of these areas.
And so there will be losers.
One has to remember somebody gets disrupted.
Yeah.
It's traditionally the old line players who are not innovating, and they're the traditional constituency of the right and have the loudest voice. People expect General Motors or General Electric or Siemens to have more clout and say in these arguments.
We've talked about these magical, unproven technologies from fusion to novel steels and cements and so on. What do you think are the chances that we can get to a global net zero by 2050 off the back of these radical and unproven technologies?
I would put it the following way. We will have the ability to get to global net zero. Whether we do it or not is a political question. Technology is absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. There's other factors like politics. It's not very fun being disrupted. This is why, from my point of view, if we can build fusion boilers and get the coal power plant industry and the natural gas power plant industry behind us, the people who own those plants, so their value doesn't go to zero, they are our partners. We're doing that in cement. A cement plant where an auxiliary product is the carbon captured as product. So the total capacity of the existing cement plant will actually go up because the carbon's been put into new carbonates that make more cement. Beautiful idea. If you can repurpose an existing power plant, an existing cement plant, it becomes easier to get the incumbents, the disrupted, along, and will accelerate the process.
And easier then to build the coalition that we need to
the
tackle
political
this huge,
side of things.
to tackle this huge problem. Reflecting on my conversation with Vinod, I'm struck by three things. Firstly, he puts an awful lot of importance on the idea of the instigator, the individual who can have an outsized impact. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Think about Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. The second thing he does is he can visualize the potential of the improbable or the highly unlikely. He can paint a picture of the future when these technologies get real. But then, finally, he brings it back down to something more prosaic. We just need to get going. And if we get going, we might finally get there. I'm Azeem Azhar, and you've been watching Exponentially.